أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في أمريكا تطول فترة الانتقال من الرئيس إلى رئيس آخر، وتستمر من بداية نوفمبر إلى الأسبوع الثالث من يناير، ويمكن أن تحدث أمور كثيرة أثناء ذلك الوقت. الرئيس بايدن الذي يمكنه الادعاء بأنه الديمقراطي الوحيد الذي هزم ترامب سيبقى الرئيس الرسمي حتى اللحظة التي يؤدي فيها ترامب اليمين الدستورية، وإلى أن يحدث ذلك سيسافر بايدن حول العالم لإكمال المهام المترتبة عليه في أوروبا وأفريقيا والشرق الأوسط. وسيبقى أعضاء الكونغرس القديم بمجلسيه الشيوخ والنواب في مناسبهم حتى يستلم الأعضاء الجدد وظائفهم في يناير. وخلال هذه الفترة يتواجب عليهم القيام بأعمال مهمة، من تمويل الحكومة إلى الموافقة على التشريعات الرئيسية المتعلقة بالدفاع الوطني. بشكل عام لا تزال البلاد تتفاعل مع النجاح الجمهوريين في الانتخابات، أما الديمقراطيون فهم ينتقدون أدائهم ويفكرون في قيادة جديدة للحزب. لمناقشة ما يحدث في واشنطن وفي الولايات المتحدة خلال هذه الفترة الانتقالية، يسعدني أن أرحب باللجنة من الخبراء السياسيين نيومي لين، ألكسندر بولتون ونورمان أورنستين. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Presidential transitions. They're almost uniquely an American tradition. 10 weeks from Election Day to the inauguration of a new president. 10 weeks in which the old president is still president. And 8 weeks in which the old Congress is still Congress. Let's take a look at what is happening during this unusual period in American political life. Well, we've had some big news from Joe Biden, and hopefully Norm Ornstein and Naomi Lynn can help explain this. Norm, Joe Biden pardoned his son. Well, what was all that about, and why is it important?
So Joe Biden's son, Hunter, had faced charges and a trial in which he had actually pled guilty over two different offenses. There were two trials. One was that he had lied on an application for a gun, saying that he did not have a drug or addiction problem when he did. Now, this was a gun that he had actually purchased while depressed and was contemplating suicide. He had it in his possession for a day before his then wife found it. The other was that he had not paid taxes over several years, totaling a very large sum of money. Ultimately, he repaid the Internal Revenue Service with interest. Both of those charges are normally not prosecuted as felonies, but through a long and convoluted process, they were for Hunter Biden. Joe Biden had said he would let the process play out. He was not going to pardon his son. But in the aftermath of the election, with an attorney general nominee for Donald Trump and an FBI director nominee for Donald Trump, pledging, as Trump had, retribution against his enemies, and that included Hunter Biden, Joe Biden reversed course and pardoned his son going back 10 years for all of those offenses. It has raised a lot of hackles among Democrats who said we're losing the high ground here for Donald Trump, who has pledged that he would pardon what he calls the January 6th hostages, the violent insurrectionists, many of whom have been sentenced to substantial jail sentences, and that he would pardon them. Some said, well, this gives him an open avenue to do that. But of course, he had already said he was going to do that. And Trump himself had pardoned, among others, 3 military people, some convicted of war crimes, Medicare fraudsters, and a lot of his own cronies, including in particular, Rob, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner's father, Charles Kushner, who was pardoned for a series of pretty awful offenses, but has now been nominated to be ambassador to France. So we've got a lot going on here in the pardon world.
So, Naomi, let's just focus for a moment on how other Democrats are viewing Joe Biden's decision, because it does have an impact on how they deal with Donald Trump for the next 4 years.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And I thought it was interesting in your opener where you sort of mentioned, typically in this time, the president becomes less of a focal point and we focus more on the president-elect. But this news sort of really thrust Biden back into the spotlight. And it was time, coincidentally, before he went on his sort of long or highly anticipated trip to Africa, to Angola. So he's not really around to answer questions properly about this sort of decision, change in decision that he made. In terms of like the Democratic Party's response to this, it's sort of been twofold. You have Biden sympathizers who sort of say they can kind of understand where he's coming from in terms of a father. This son has been through a lot. And so I think there is sort of some forgiveness for that. But I've also been struck by, and what sort of Norm mentioned, this public criticism of the president for ceding this high ground. And basically what they're saying is that it puts him in a difficult position, because obviously we just have seen that the American public re-elected somebody who is a convicted felon. And as sort of Democrats in the party try to figure out how to be this opposition to Trump, because we're seeing it play out very differently to what it was in 2016, it sort of made that harder for them. It also sort of sets this template that, potentially Trump can pardon himself maybe, before his time is up in the next 4 years, and sort of leads them to not being able to really address sort of what they see as the things that he's committed, whether it be the January 6th election interference, whether it sort of be the handling of the mishandling of classified information. So it's really kind of, the Democrats are already sort of in this political wilderness state in terms of not having a new leader and sort of someone to rally around. But now their sort of roadmap to countering Trump has sort of been, the rug has been taken out from underneath them.
I mean, Norm, Democrats were already divided on the extent to which to blame Joe Biden for the election defeat, for having stayed around as long as he did and not handing over the reins earlier, or at least opening it up to a potential successor earlier. Will this only strengthen the critique of Joe Biden within the party?
Well, certainly, as Naomi said, Democrats are very divided on this one. There are substantial numbers of them inside Congress and among governors, Jared Polis of Colorado, for example, who have been very critical of him. But we're going to get a lot of soul searching among Democrats about why they lost. And certainly some have blamed Biden, others have blamed Kamala Harris. The fundamental reality, though, Rob, is that, and I think Democrats are ultimately going to come to this conclusion, that it was less about their own administration and candidates and more about a broader distaste for people in power, something that we've seen in the aftermath of COVID and with the inflation that followed, with almost every ruling party suffering losses as a consequence. And more broadly, what Democrats are going to have to confront, I believe, is a rejection of expertise, of science, of doctors from COVID, and of a ruling elite. And that's the bigger question for them, not whether Joe Biden or Kamala Harris blew it, but why and how they can get out from under the criticism coming from working class people, especially, that all of those who've been in power have both condescended to them and screwed up their lives.
Well, that's going to be a big, deep, powerful debate. In the meantime, Naomi, 10 weeks from election to inauguration of the new president, what on the foreign policy agenda does Joe Biden want to accomplish during this period?
I think there are two big bucket list items for him, particularly on the world stage. Like he might be in Africa, but where his attention is elsewhere, and that is the Ukraine war against Russia, as well as the Israel war against Hamas, Hezbollah in the Middle East. And I think those are two sort of very protracted issues that, if we're being honest, very unlikely to be wrapped up by January 20. And there's also it's in this unusual predicament where we can only really have one president at a time, but having Trump sort of in the background has actually created a little bit more political leverage within those two conflicts. I think what we're going to see with the Ukraine war is we've already seen Biden sort of talking about Biden sort of changing his mind on different things, but he's been a lot more proactive in terms of Ukraine surging funding there, as well as sort of giving them a lot more leeway to attack Russia sort of in Russia's own territory, which it has had ripple effects in terms of Putin loosening his sort of standard for nuclear reactions to that. On the Israel front, I think the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's relationship with Biden, while they are still working toward the hostage release, doesn't seem to have improved. There was reporting that the telephone call with them very recently only lasted a couple of minutes, and so it's very sort of doesn't give you a lot of hope that there'll be sort of a hostage deal anytime soon. But I think what has been really interesting is that you've seen sort of Trump on social media sort of say lay down the law in terms of wanting a hostage deal very, very quickly.
So we're joined now by Alex Bolton. Alex, glad to have you with us on the show. So we've seen Joe Biden make post-election innovations, to put it politely, in his on key issues. No pardon. Finally, post-election, yes, a pardon. Ukraine, you can't use these missiles deep into Russia. Post-election, go ahead and use them 200 miles into Russia. Alex, are there other issues that we can expect Joe Biden in his final weeks to make an about face?
That's a big mystery. I don't know what he's going to do. I think he's already kind of played his cards, is sort of my view of it. I think his administration is really winding down. The focus is on Trump. Could he do something else? Is there another pardon out there, or a series of pardons that he could make? The House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries has called on Biden to issue many pardons for people not violent convicts, people serving either time in prison or who've been convicted in the past, to grant them pardons for non-violent crimes. That is something that he could do. That would be very controversial. Whether he wants to, add maybe another little, piece to his legacy before he leaves, that's something that certainly would ingratiate himself with the Democratic base. So that's a possibility. Beyond that, I don't know. I can't think of any, lingering issues off the top of my head that the president may want to address right before he leaves.
Norm, is there a domestic priority or something else that you think Joe Biden might try to leave his mark on before he leaves office?
I do, Rob, and in particular, it involves the status of undocumented people in the United States. We know that Trump has pledged that the first thing he's going to do on day one is to begin detention and then deportation of up to 12 million people, many of whom have been here for decades. But we also know that there are a number of immigrants here on a temporary legal status while they're working in jobs that others do not want to take. They're not just farm workers. We know that during the campaign, we had a big kerfluffle over workers in Springfield, Ohio. Those who paid attention to our campaign will remember Donald Trump saying, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, these Haitian immigrants who were invited in by Springfield because they had a terrible problem filling jobs. He has been asked, Biden has, by many groups who support immigration, to extend the temporary legal status to a substantial number of other immigrants from places like Guatemala and El Salvador and maybe even Venezuela, that would make it harder to pick them up and then move to deport them. So there's more there that will be an attempt to avoid some of the worst things that Biden and a lot of people fear about Trump. The other thing I'd mention, though, Rob, is that Biden is under some pressure from a number of people on Ukraine to free up the Russian frozen assets that we have. We don't have a huge amount in the United States, but they're probably $270 billion worth in Europe. And if that money, almost $300 billion, went to Ukraine, it would provide a lot more opportunity for Zelensky and the Ukrainians to carry on against the invasion of Russia. And the U.S. is an opinion leader there. I expect also that Biden will do whatever he can to shore up NATO against what's likely to be a pretty much all-out assault by Donald Trump.
And before we go on break, Naomi, is there anything newsworthy that we can expect Kamala Harris to do in the 10 weeks between election and inauguration, in the weeks that are left before she has to leave the vice president's office?
I'm not sure about newsworthy in the very short term, but something that I'm watching for her is what she intends to do after this campaign. She's had a very quiet presence after the campaign, sort of a lot of Democrats sort of really coming to terms with the election, and particularly as a candidate, I can imagine it being quite exhausting. She spent most sort of a week in Hawaii, so she's rested. She's now back in DC taking sort of internal meetings and things like that. But watching what she does in the future, there are a couple of options. I mean, there's been talk about her potentially running for California governor, something that she would probably have the field cleared for her, even though there are already candidates sort of announced for the race. There is sort of some speculation that she might come back in 2028 as a Democratic candidate, but I just feel like that is something that is a pie in the sky, considering she just ran a campaign that had $1 billion and came out second best.
Okay, well, when we come back after the break, we're going to move to the other major institution that is facing transition, and that is Congress. Now, Congress has less time than the president because the new Congress will be seated in early January. What do they have to do in the time that it remains? And what will be the first tasks of the new Congress? We'll discuss this right after the break. Our guests today include Naomi Lim. Naomi is White House reporter at the Washington Examiner. She previously reported on crime and politics for News Corp in her native Australia. Also with us is Norman Ornstein. Norm is Emeritus Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and one of America's wisest experts on politics, Congress, and the presidency. And with us today also is Alexander Bolton. Alex is senior staff writer at The Hill, a newspaper offering in-depth reporting on the politics and policy in our national legislature, where he covers Congress and the broader American political scene. Okay, let's turn to you, Alex. The existing Congress, only a few days left before some of them go home. What important business is left on their agenda?
There was a setback for Democrats. They're leaving possibly as many as 4 circuit court seats open that they were not able to fill under Biden's term and their majority control. So they're going to move on from judges. They're going to be focused on passing the National Defense Authorization Bill. This is something that they have passed for 60 years in a row. The time is really winding down. They're going to try to get this wrapped up. And then the week right before Christmas, they're going to try to get a CR, a continuing resolution, to fund the government through the end of March, probably. And that's going to include up to $100 billion in disaster relief for all the damage caused by Milton and Helene in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina. And so those are really the 3 priorities there.
So judges, the defense budget, and the overall national budget sound like 3 pretty important tasks. why would the Republicans want to go along with any of this? Wouldn't the Republicans want to push all this as much as possible to the next Congress where they're in total control?
Well, that's exactly what they're doing. Now, the National Defense Authorization Act, it's not a funding bill, it's an authorization bill. And basically, it sets the groundwork for funding programs that are going to be filled next year. The CR, the continuing resolution, that is a stopgap that just lasts for a few months. It basically freezes current funding levels and programs. All of that is going to be relitigated, renegotiated in January, February, March, when Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House. And that's going to be, frankly, a big mess for Republicans right off the bat next year. Some Republicans, like Mitch McConnell, Susan Collins, the Senate Republican leader, the top Republican on the Senate Appropriations Committee, they wanted to get all the spending bills done this year to clear the decks for Donald Trump, but it looks like that's not going to happen. So the next year, the first 90 days of Trump's term is going to start off with a huge spending fight.
Norm, who are you going to miss when this current Congress adjourns and some of them go home for good?
So there were a couple of senators who lost races, Democrats, John Tester in Montana and Sherrod Brown in Ohio. And it'll be interesting to see Sherrod Brown, a long-time Democrat, a kind of populist Democrat who had been very popular, but lost his race. But there's going to be an opening in Ohio, his state, because J.D. Vance is moving to be the vice president. And at some point in the next few months, there will be a special election to fill that Senate seat, and we might see Sherrod Brown back. But Tester and Brown are kind of very interesting, funny, and passionate individuals, and they will be missed in the Senate. I have to say, Rob, that I'm a little surprised that Democrats in the Senate, who have another month with the majority, and then it will be gone. There will be 53 Republicans coming in, 52 for a short while until they have a replacement for J.D. Vance. And then we also need a replacement if Marco Rubio of Florida gets confirmed as Secretary of State. But I'm surprised that Democrats are not seizing this opportunity to do more than just get some judges, having already cut a deal to eliminate the possibility of getting these 4 prize Court of Appeals positions filled, and what Alex talked about. But we're not seeing, for example, any hearings, pre-confirmation hearings on some of the most controversial nominations of Donald Trump. And we aren't seeing hearings on policies. For example, knowing that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is going to be up as Secretary of Health and Human Services, blocking vaccines, saying that he will stop all research on difficult diseases for the next 8 years if he can, on what is very controversial Schedule F, which would enable Trump to fire civil servants and replace them with his cronies, which is, by most standards, given the web of protections for the civil service, illegal. Why they're not holding hearings to set the table now is a little bit of a puzzle. Instead, they're just not going to be around that much. So that's, I think, a lost opportunity for Democrats.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. I'll just add, Norm, I'm going to miss Mitt Romney. But with that, we're going to say thank you to Norm, Alex, and Naomi. Thank you for joining us this week on داخل واشنطن. وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول موضوع الحلقة، خاصة مستقبل الحزب الديمقراطي خلال إدارة ترامب الثانية، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. أراكم في الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.